The magic finger. We part one in the first video. Go back to that one if you haven't seen it. We ended with the words, Mr. Greg did not like it one bit. Be off, he cried. And he shot at them. He means the ducks. Many times, but it was no good. He simply could not hit them. All the way home, those four ducks flew around in the sky above their heads, and nothing would make them go away. Part two. Late that night, after Philip and William had gone to bed, Mr. Greg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of a wild duck in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Greg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw the four ducks, dark against the night sky, flying very close together. They were going around and around the house. Mr. Greg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He did not like what was going on, but he said nothing about it to Mrs. Greg. All he said was, "Come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." So they went to bed to sleep. When morning came, Mr. Greg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put out a hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "Well, that's funny," he said. "Where's my hand?" He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe he had hurt that hand in some way. He tried the other hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then for the first time, he saw what he looked like. He gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Greg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Greg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too, for he was now a tiny, tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck wings instead. But, cried Mrs. Greg, going purple in the face. "My dear man, what's happened to you?" "What's happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Greg. It was Mrs. Greg's turn to jump out of bed. She ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Greg, and she too had got wings instead of arms. "Oh, oh, oh, oh," sobbed Mrs. Greg. "This is witch's work," cried Mr. Greg, and both of them started running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. "Mama, Mama, Mama," chirped Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly." And they flew up into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Greg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out the window. Mr. and Mrs. Greg ran to the window and looked out. The tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Greg said to Mr. Greg, "Do you think we could do that too, dear?" "I don't see why not," Mr. Greg said. "Come on, let's try." Mr. Greg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once, up he went. Then Mrs. Greg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going up. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Greg. "Don't be afraid." So out the window they flew, far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family was flying around and around together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, are they, dear?" Mr. Greg asked Mrs. Greg. "Not at all," Mrs. Greg said. "I could go on forever." "Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody is working in our garden." They all looked down. And there before them, in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous wild ducks. The ducks were as big as men, and what is more, they had great long arms like men instead of wings. The ducks were walking in a line to the door of the Greg's house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Greg, flying down low over their heads. "Go away! That's my house." The ducks looked up and quacked. The first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him. The door shut. The Gregs flew down and sat on the wall near the door. Mrs. Greggs began to cry. Oh dear, she sobbed. "They have taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go." Even the boys began to cry a bit now. "We will be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip. "I want to sleep in my own bed," said William. "Now then," said Mr. Gregg, "it isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we're going to do?" "What?" they said. Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled. "We are going to build a nest." "A nest," they said. "Can we do that?" "We must do that," said Mr. Gregg. "We got to have somewhere to sleep. Follow me." They flew off to a tall tree, and right at the top of it, Mr. Gregg chose the place for the nest. That's the end of part 2. If you're in my book club, please go to the questions and answer them before you start part 3.